Most teams underperform, not because of bad people, but broken systems. And this episode shows you how to fix that with real research-backed strategies. I'm joined by the expert on the subject, Colin Fisher. He's a Harvard-trained management professor. He's the author of a brand new book called The Collective Edge and a former jazz musician. We bust the biggest myths about trust, teamwork, and leadership, why more people equal slower teams, how to reset a broken team without firing people, and what it really takes to build a high-performing team in 2025 and beyond. What's your take on team building exercises?
Team building exercises are one of the most misunderstood things that I encounter in my research and in my teaching, where people, when I say I study teams, I study group dynamics, people automatically, their mind goes to these team building exercises. But the funny thing is, a lot of these team building exercises are based on a kind of misguided understanding of how teams develop.
You're saying if I let myself fall into the arms of my teammate, that's not going to help us build a great team?
No, unfortunately, if only trust falls were a recipe for better team dynamics, that would certainly make my job easier, although it might put me out of work a little bit too. So
it's a bit more complex than
yes,
that, right?
It is a bit more complex. So there's kind of this idea out there in the popular imagination that in order for us to work together, we need to trust each other first. And there's, of course, some truth to that we're a lot more likely to collaborate well with somebody that we really trust. But there's actually two different flavors of trust. There's trust, like I trust you with my deepest, darkest secrets and to reveal everything about my inner world and show myself. And that we usually would call relational trust. But most teams actually need more of task-based trust, that when you say you're going to do something, you're going to do that thing and you're going to do it up to a pretty good standard of work. So when I'm depending on you and we're interdependent in a team, you're going to give me your work. I'm going to be able to use it. And that kind of trust is actually built through the process of working together.
So trust is built while we are working together. We don't have to build trust in order to work together.
But it's tricky because, of course, it is a never-ending circle that you need at least a little bit of trust to say, hey, I'm going to work on a team with you. And that means I'm going to depend on you for some things. And somebody does have to take that leap first. But that doing these kinds of fake fun trust falls that are meant to fundamentally build more of that relational, socio-emotional trust, those things actually don't translate very well into teams working together better. And so the research on real team building shows that the more task-like the exercises that you're doing ahead of time are, the more it's like simulating the real work you're going to do together, the more that builds cooperative capacity. And so the further away we get from that, when we're doing trust falls, when we're putting on silly hats, when we're doing relay races outside, those things aren't doing as good a job as often just getting to work might do.
That's so fascinating. I mean, how did you get into this game? I know you were a jazz musician before you became one of the leading researchers and thought leaders on teams. How are these two related?
Yeah, well, it's the usual story, right? It's, you go to music school, you become a jazz musician, and then they make you a business school professor at the other end of it, right? Yeah. But I've always been fascinated with the collaborative aspects of life, in part because, I don't tell anyone, but I'm a little bit of a loner in my real life. And so on some level, looking at people in groups and teams is something I could look at from the outside and go, wait a minute, how does that work? Everybody seems so happy in these groups. How did those really work? But then being in the world of jazz and really having to collaborate deeply and collaborate with a really wide variety of different kinds of people all over the world really opened my eyes to how groups can bring out, the best in us and things that we don't even know we have within us. So I was playing music, and as many of us do as jazz musicians, move down to New York and try to, quote unquote, make it as a musician in New York. And as I was doing that, I worked on a master's degree where I studied improvisation in the arts across all different kinds of art forms. So I was looking at theater and comedy and dance and, of course, different musical traditions. And as I was writing my master's thesis, I stumbled across the research of this woman who was doing work on the social psychology of creativity. And her name was Teresa Amabile, and it turned out she taught in a business school, Harvard Business School, in fact. And so I thought, maybe she'd be interested in this idea of how do teams collaborate more creatively. And that was really what I wanted to know. Under what conditions can teams spontaneously come up with ideas that no one of the people involved could have come up with? And that's something we experience all the time in jazz and in music. And to my everlasting surprise, Teresa thought that was a good idea, and then you become a business school professor. So
you did your PhD at Harvard, and
I did my PhD at Harvard, and while I was there, I also started working with a really well-known scholar of groups and teams, and so much of the book owes its intellectual legacy to him, and that's Richard Hackman. So if you're into teams and you want to know more about them, Richard's research is really at the base for all of us. And we started working together on questions, especially about coaching teams. So one of the things that really sparked my research on teams was he was working with Anita Woolley, who's now a professor at Carnegie Mellon, but she was a postdoc at Harvard at the time. And they were actually working with the U.S. government on these interagency analysis teams where they were sharing information across different government agencies, which is a big problem, actually. You'd think the government all easily shares information with each other.
Lots of silos, I'm sure. Yeah.
But no, they don't. So they were training this team leader who read Richard's book called Leading Teams, and he really understood everything. He was a great student. He knew the material, and then he went in to try and put it into practice. And Richard and Anita came back to our research group, and they said, this guy just had terrible timing. He could not read the group. He didn't really understand how to insert himself into the ongoing flow of group process. And that really was the beginning of me trying to say, I think that is improvisation. I think that's how we are understanding and reacting to other people, how we listen, how we help. Those things, I think, are fundamentally about the same things that we deal with as jazz musicians.
It's an interesting analogy, right? That a team, which is probably the same size roughly as a jazz combo, also has to riff off each other. There's chaos, but there's also order, and it's a back and forth, and everyone is playing their role. Only if everyone's playing together well is there a beautiful outcome in the form of a new product, a creative campaign, or whatever it may be for a team, as well as beautiful music that we love to go to a jazz club and listen to.
I mean, a jazz combo is a team. Many of the things are exactly the same. The importance of listening to one another, of responding, the interdependence, the way in which different roles come together, those things are really highlighted in a jazz situation. But that I do think that jazz, sometimes we do have an advantage over other kinds of teams and organizations, which is we have very clear roles based on the instruments we play, that we have a lot of shared knowledge and shared norms about how we're going to behave in these situations. Whereas if you're in a management consulting team or you're in a project team in your organization, those roles aren't always so clear. The norms aren't always so clear. And most importantly, making music is fun. It's got a lot of the characteristics that psychology research has shown that we like in tasks. They're intrinsically motivating, as we'd say as social psychologists. But not all work has that character. And so in jazz, we definitely have some things that are just like every other team. But we also have some advantages that other kinds of teams don't have. And sometimes
you show up with a trumpet, right?
Yeah.
And it's clear that you're the trumpeter.
That's right.
Whereas in a team, everyone has the same laptop, and it's not obvious who does what, unless there's good leadership.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have to create that. And I think that what gets overlooked is that in these areas where we don't have clear norms, we don't have clear roles, we don't have super motivating tasks, it's our job to create those things. And when we take all of our lessons about teamwork from situations that are like musical ensembles or sports teams, but we can't forget that that those situations also have some advantages that we often don't have in the rest of our lives.
That's a really good point. Do you think that we've pushed the cultural idea of the individual too far in recent decades? We talk about the political leader, we talk about great entrepreneurs building these companies. Very few people talk about the teams that are actually doing the work. Would you say it's gone too far?
I absolutely think it's gone too far, and that there's been a lot of research showing that individualism is on the rise all over the world. So even in countries that we usually think of having more collectivistic values, China and other East Asian countries are the kind of prototypical, more collectivistic cultures where people think of their friends, their families, their organizations as more a part of themselves, where especially in America as one of the prototypical individualistic countries, people tend to not think of, even their close family members as much of as part of themselves. And so that's a big cultural difference. But that even in collectivist countries, individualism's on the rise. And that no matter what measures we look at, we see people using more individualistic language. We see more people living alone. We see people with increasingly smaller families. There's a lot of indications that individualism is on the rise. And it's compounded by the same factors that you mentioned, our sort of obsession with lone geniuses and these great CEOs and political leaders and inventors as the movers and shakers of history. When we really look underneath the stories of any great business, any invention, and any great artistic product, except for in a few very individualistic domains, we usually find a group. And that we find there's more people than just the one who's getting all the credit. Thomas Edison's a classic example where we all know Thomas Edison's name. And a lot of people think he invented the light bulb, which he absolutely did not do. That the light bulb had been invented quite a while before Edison ever came along, but that he patented a mass market version of the light bulb that is closer to what we all use today.
Yeah.
He was not working alone. He had a whole team that he called his muckers. And for the most part, those people are lost to history. Historians have kind of unpeeled the layers of this story and found a lot of these people were, just as responsible as Edison for these outcomes. And it's the same when we look at, who wins the Nobel Prize. We look at, who wins, Oscars or, who's elected to high offices in every country around the world. They're not doing it on their own. And that groups and teams are still humanity's best tool for solving problems. And when we think of ourselves just as individuals as, that's going to be the way the world changes, is by me changing myself, by me going it alone, or I'm going to put my faith in this one leader and they're going to do all the change. That's really just not how the world works.
I agree. I think we pushed the Lone Ranger dom too far, and it is often the case that many people do the work and the one person gets the credit / the blame. In a way, it's an easier story to tell, right? It kind of fits in with sort of the modern media narrative, but also in general how we can talk about things happening in the world, that there's a protagonist and antagonist, they have obstacles, etc. So it kind of makes sense that we went too far in this direction. But if we take it back a little, how do we build a great team? How big does it have to be? How diverse? What should it look like? If I'm running a business or need to build a new team, how would I go about it?
How do I build a great team? If you're asking yourself that question, you're already kind of ahead of the game. So just saying how big should it be? It's amazing how many leaders don't ever ask themselves that question. There's a great study by my collaborator, Ruth Wagaman, and some of her colleagues from the Hay Group, where they looked at different top management teams around the world. I think there were 111 top management teams in their study. And the way you get on some of these top management teams is just sometimes by asking, right? It's like, can I start coming to the meeting? And they always say yes, and they keep growing and they keep growing and they keep growing. And no one says, well, what would a good size for this team to actually be. And in fact, in that study, nobody knew how big the teams actually were. So when you asked all the different members, how big is this team? How many people are on our top management team? Only 7% of top management teams agreed on how many people were on the team. 93% of them disagreed and gave different numbers than the CEO did. So it's something that a lot of people do approach really thoughtlessly. So I've kind of given you the long preamble to you're ahead of the game by thinking about it, but that the answer is you want to have 4 or 5 people on your team, ideally. Or if we want to expand that out a little bit, 3 to 7 members is about where we have enough skill to solve problems we couldn't solve as individuals, enough information, perspectives, whatever it is we need. But we don't have too many coordination costs that accrue when we add more members to a team.
It's interesting. Coordination costs are real, right? Because often it feels like, teamwork, and kids say like, it would be way faster if I did it on my own. Is that true?
Well, for some things, right, there are definitely times when coordination costs outweigh the value of teamwork. And researchers have looked at when that's most likely to happen. And that it's most likely to happen in really simple, repetitive tasks. So if all we're doing is, putting letters into envelopes or something, or we're shoveling snow, we don't want to collaborate in the sense of we're both trying to put the same letter into the same envelope or to use the same shovel, right? That we just want to add up individual contributions, but we want people to fundamentally work on those tasks independently, not collaboratively.
Yeah.
But the more collaborative the task gets and the more complex the work is, the more value there is in collaboration. So when we're doing things like we need new inventions, we need to solve big problems in the organization, we need to solve big problems in the world, those are jobs for teams, but not so much individuals.
So there's always a cost to working together, but there isn't always a gain. So when we're thinking about teamwork, we have to ensure that the gains are bigger than the cost of just making sure we're working together. And I see this a lot in communications, right? That teams that are not particularly functioning well, there's so much communication because they are not completely aligned in terms of the mission, in terms of the goals they're pursuing, which means they have to constantly check in due to this lack of clarity.
In a way, it's a good sign if there's a lot of this communication when there's a lack of clarity, because at least it's showing that people are motivated to make it clearer than it is right now. And so if you notice people are confused, being confused about the goals is the natural first place to look. So I think that's absolutely true, and that if we're seeing a lot of communication that doesn't seem like people are on the same page, that's definitely the time to reaffirm our goals, for somebody to say, hey, this is my understanding of what it is we're supposed to be doing. Is that your understanding? And to have that conversation. There's actually interesting research that this didn't make it into the book, and I wish it did. I think this was a study of innovation, like tech companies in the kind of 1990s boom. And they looked at the amount of communication in these top management teams, and they compared the teams that were really seemed agile and doing well and moving fast and making fast decisions to the teams that were not adapting to the environment very well. And they actually found that the teams that were moving the fastest and making the fastest decisions were communicating more. And that actually what happens when teams are really dysfunctional, I think more dysfunctional than the situation you were describing, is they start avoiding. They start avoiding each other. They start avoiding
disengaged.
the really important issues. And even the top management teams of companies will stop talking to each other about the strategy if it becomes too emotionally taxing for them to do it. So, like I said, as long as we're all communicating a lot, everyone still seems engaged to me. And I'm saying that's right. A team that we can still really help. They just need to get clearer on the goals. But when we're not communicating a lot, that's not always a good sign. That's often a sign that it's like we're actually a bit disengaged. We don't care about finding this clarity for ourselves because, we're all in a changing environment. We're all doing our work. The situation today is different than the situation yesterday. And we need some of that communication to stay on the same page.
It's such a good point. And what I recommend to leaders is if they see too many Slack messages going back and forth about alignment questions, pause, reflect, and try to inject clarity because that is a sign there's probably something amiss that can probably be corrected relatively easily. I do think we underestimate the complexity of teams, right, as they grow, or groups, let's say businesses. When you have, these are numbers from your book, obviously. A group of 2 only needs to manage 1 relationship. A group of 20, it's not a big company, a group of 20, you have 190 individual bilateral relationships. Wow. Just this relatively small company of 20 people, you almost have 200 relationships between people. And that is a lot to manage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we really underestimate this. And if we go back to this idea that we're trying to solve problems by adding people to a team.
Yeah,
we're adding a lot of complexity.
That is so true. Yeah. That is so true. The usual response in an organization, there's a problem, something needs to get done, let's get more people in. And it seems like the obvious thing to do, but usually to reduce the complexity rather than adding people, which increases the complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a famous engineer at IBM who coined what was called Brooks's Law, which said if you want to make a late project later, add more manpower to the team. And so, so it's definitely kind of a truism that, people try to solve a lot of problems in teams. The team's running behind. It seems like things aren't going well. Maybe we don't have the expertise we need, and we're just going to add somebody, but then we're not going to subtract anybody to kind of make the coordination easier. So it's absolutely the case that we underestimate how complex it is to manage a team of 10 relative to a team of 6, right?
Right.
It's not just 40% more complicated. This is an exponential function where it doesn't just, go one more click up the complexity scale. It goes quite a few clicks up with each person we add. So the advice of having these really small teams where if we were sitting around a table and we had, a hour-long meeting, everyone could contribute to a meeting, could be heard, feel like they were able to contribute their opinions. And that if we, almost everyone who's worked, you can think of what that size really is. It's like, in a meeting that's like got 4 or 5 people, I feel really good about our chances, right? Like that if we meet for an hour, we're all going to know what each other think about this issue. But if there's 10 people there, and now it's like, maybe not, that our chances aren't that great. And if they're 20, there's no chance, right? Like we're not going to have an hour-long meeting where everyone can contribute. And yet, this is how people work. That people are like, oh yeah, I have my team meeting with all 25 of my people every day. And it's like, well, who is that for? What's that accomplishing?
Yeah. And the EU, 27 or 28 member states that, you have the ministers or heads of government, and you go around the table and everyone states their position, the meeting's over essentially, which makes it so hard to get to results quickly. And that's why everything takes so long in Brussels. What about diversity? Is there a sweet spot? Is a certain degree of diversity good for innovation, team coherence, performance, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So usually more diversity is generally better for learning, for innovation, and for doing these kinds of complex problem-solving kinds of tasks that we usually want people who have different information, different perspectives, different expertise. And that's the value a team can really provide. Now, you would think that, as you say, there's kind of this Goldilocks effect of diversity where if you have too little, if everyone thinks the same thing, everyone knows exactly the same information, there's not much opportunity for members to learn from one another and kind of come to a synthesis and achieve what I call in the book synergy, where the group is more than the sum of its parts, right?
Yeah, and that's groupthink, right? You have 7 people, they all think alike because they went to the same university, they're all full-stack engineers or, business majors or whatever, and they essentially have the same the same school of thought.
Yeah. And so that much research tells us absolutely can happen, that we can have too little diversity in the team and that team's going to underperform its kind of collective potential. Now, theoretically, it should be possible to have too much diversity as well. And if we push that to an extreme, think of a group where no two people speak the same language, right? Like, yeah, we all have really different backgrounds, really different knowledge, really different skills, so much so that we can't understand each other. So that, in theory, that's certainly possible. But that in actual organizations, research really doesn't find much evidence that we ever get to that really high degree of diversity, and that so much so that a team can't collaborate. And that for many years, researchers kept finding, there was some situations where too much diversity was harming team performance. But a recent study by Dutch researchers found that all the studies that were finding these negative effects, or I should say the predominant effect of averaging all of them, so not each individual study, but that generally speaking, the studies that found a negative effect of high levels of diversity were times where there was no objective performance measure, and the performance was being measured by somebody outside the team. So a manager was looking at that team and giving that more diverse team lower performance ratings, not that the team was objectively performing worse. And that suggests that, again, when you take that effect out and you take all the teams that didn't have objective performance measures out, we still see a positive effect of diversity on team performance. So at least where my read of this literature right now is, if there's an upper limit to how much diversity real teams in your organization should have, that the same organization already hired all these people and they work there and work together, it doesn't seem like making the team more diverse is going to hurt performance. It seems like, if anything, it's going to help performance. And that it's definitely the case that if we're left to our own devices, there's this effect called homophily, where birds of a feather flock together, essentially, that like we're likely to go to people who think like us and look like us and are more like us in a variety of dimensions.
Yeah.
So most of the time, what you need to do is add diversity to your team.
Makes sense. I think that's the reality of business, not that people can't speak the same language.
Yes.
It'd be silly. What about hierarchy? Is it good to have levels of hierarchy in a team?
So hierarchy, this is another area where I think if there's a perfect level of hierarchy, we haven't done a great job of perfectly quantifying it, but that generally more hierarchy harms team performance. So the more hierarchy we have, the harder it is for that team to be flexible, to learn, to grow. Now, there also is, some kind of newish research showing having extreme levels of flatness where everybody is completely equal can be difficult, and that the whole organizations that have almost no hierarchy often do struggle with some of the challenges that emerge from that. And so I think the question is really, when do we need different forms of leadership, and who can provide that? And that when do we need people to set direction, somebody to step in and say, hey, it seems like we're all confused. Let's try and get back on the same page. And that, do we need formal ranks to do all those things? Do we need formal roles? In some cases, yes. But that teams really benefit when they do share leadership more broadly. And we don't say, you, Oliver, you're the leader of this team. And that means you're responsible for every leadership function we can imagine. You've got to set direction. You've got to get all our resources. You've got to manage our processes and do all the helping and coaching. And that's generally teams that spread that load out or do what we call share leadership tend to do better than teams that consolidate all of those leadership functions in a single person.
It would require this one person to be better at everything than anyone else. And often it's that sort of situational leadership where naturally the group looks at one person and says, you're probably the best to, lead this project because you have the most experience in this area. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, groups are wonderful. We all love to work in teams. I love to have a team, and we all have that group instinct in us, right?
Mm-hmm.
But humans are also motivated by autonomy. So how do we square that circle?
I think you've hit on, the fundamental tension of our impulse for group, to be part of a group, and to experience this sense of belonging and being accepted by others, with our need, and it's a very fundamental, deep psychological need, to be the masters of our own destiny, that we want to experience autonomy. We don't like to feel controlled. We're less motivated. We're less creative. We don't learn as well when we feel like we're being controlled from the outside. So these two things are always a little bit in tension, because being a member of a group means you are going to have to conform to some norms of behavior within that group. You're going to have to strive towards shared goals that hopefully are largely consonant with your individual goals, but they may not be 100% consonant. That even in a job we love, like, it would be better for the organization if we worked a little more and worked a little harder for less pay. That's better for the organization as a whole, but it's not better for us. So there's always at least a little bit of tension between these two things. And so I like to think that we get the best of both worlds when we give these small groups and what I would call a real team of 3 to 7 people who are interdependent for a complex task where it's a whole piece of work where they can sort of do the whole thing and see the results of their labor. And we give them autonomy over how to do their work. So giving people autonomy over both their goals and their processes can be a little dangerous. That if we don't have these shared goals, as you were saying in your examples before, it's easy for us to get confused and come apart. But if we're all very clear on this is what we're trying to achieve, and we can picture in our minds, this is the world that's going to exist after we're done with this group task, then you can give a team a ton of autonomy and say, well, how you get there, how you realize that, that's up to you. And that's where we can really get the best of both worlds, where we feel like, hey, this is a small enough group where I can see myself. I feel like we're getting credit. I'm recognized by my fellows. I feel this sense of belonging. But there's still a lot of autonomy in how we act, how we do things, and that I can have that input in these group meetings or in the group into how I live my life.
Makes sense. It's also good leadership, right? We agree what we work on, but you can decide how you get there. Right, and that's where the autonomy comes in. And I think this is also plausible. This sort of tension, this is not just a business, right, or an organizations. This is across the board. This is just human life, that we have these both hearts beating in our chest, the individual heart and the group heart. And somehow they need to coexist, but that also makes life beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're just so hardwired for this stuff, right? That there's no sort of deeper explanation than we've evolved to want to be in groups. That it used to be, in some ways, a huge threat to our survival if a group were to ostracize us. That we're these hairless, clawless creatures that weren't equipped to survive in the prehistoric world on our own. And so we needed groups, and that we really wanted to be a part of them. But that we also don't want to feel controlled, and we're not ants, right? There was this sort of debate in evolutionary biology that I don't know if you know the work of Edward O. Wilson, who's a really famous evolutionary biologist, and he was constantly making the case that both ants and human beings are what he calls a superorganism. That's why we take over the world. Ants are hugely successful. They weigh more than all of our domesticated animals combined. There's a lot of them. And that humans obviously are a really successful organism as well. But most evolutionary biologists, because we have this drive for autonomy, didn't accept Wilson's argument that humans actually qualify as a superorganism the same way that ants or termites or other kinds of small creatures are. So I think we have a lot of the benefits of our tendencies for cooperations and groupiness, but we don't have that cost of feeling like we're just slaves to the leader or the queen ant's.
We can opt out if it's too much. If the hive mind is technical, we can opt out.
Yes.
This is brilliant. So I would like to make this really practical now for people. And you said that an ideal team, 3 to 7 people. So if I have a team of 40, okay, should probably split this into 2. And we know this from like workshops, right? We will say, 6, 7 people is really max in one group. If we have 12, we really need 2 people there to work with the group.
Yes.
Interesting. So 3 to 7 people, diversity is good, especially diversity of thought. And hierarchy, to some extent to give guidance, but ideally meritocratic and situational, not lots of layers of hierarchy.
That's right.
If I'm a leader now and I say, okay, that's cool. What else can I do to get the most out of my team tomorrow morning when I show up at the office?
So the time when you have the most influence over your team is actually right at the very beginning. So let's say you've done everything right ahead of time. You've come up with a really great team task and a goal for that team to pursue. You've gathered a diverse mix of people, of 3 to 7 people in the room to achieve that goal. Okay, so you've done a lot of the pre-work ahead of time. Now we've got to bring that to life. And that we bring that to life by, 1, making sure we really articulate those goals and paint the picture of the future that we can all share. So the classic example is John F. Kennedy's charge to NASA to put a man on the moon within 10 years, or Bill Gates' charge to Microsoft to put a computer on every desk in every home within 5 years, right? It's a shared vision of the future that we can imagine and we can share. So we're bringing that goal to life. But then the thing that a lot of leaders don't do is to use the power of social norms to their advantage. So we usually think of social norms as being things like, how we greet each other in different countries, or, how appropriate it is to, have these emotional displays in different countries. Like in America, is much more pro big emotional display, and Germany is historically less so. So we usually think of norms as these kind of taken for granted, invisible things. But small groups develop their own norms, and they develop them really, really fast. So where you sit, who talks the most, all those things tend to emerge in the very first meeting, sometimes in the first few minutes. And so a really savvy leader can go in and say, all right, what norms do we need? And the number one thing we need is something I hope your listeners have heard of before, which is what Amy Edmondson calls psychological safety. So we need to feel like it's okay to speak up, to share our perspective, to share our information, to ask questions, to do experiments and make mistakes. And the best way to do that is for a leader to say those things, to say that you value those things. That, hey, we're going to have to experiment here. Here's the things that we have to learn that we don't know how to do. I expect us to make mistakes, sometimes to own up to those mistakes yourself in front of the group and say, hey, I've made these mistakes. Here's what I've learned. And that to keep asking these questions, they're encouraging people to share what they know and to feel safe and valued when they're doing that. And so if you do that in the very first meeting, you have a huge advantage over other groups. And then,
interesting. And if it's not a first meeting, I say I'm already working with the team, things are getting a little stale, people maybe, we can reset, right? We can just take maybe not a random Tuesday, but say, hey, at the end of the summer, let's do a reset, or beginning of the quarter, or beginning of the month, or whatever it may be. Some logical connection to the date is useful, but to shake things up, do exactly what you said, but essentially frame it as a reset, or as a next phase, let's say next chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I call those relaunches. So that launches are super powerful, and the way we can harness that power in an ongoing team is, as you say, to do a relaunch, and that it's easiest to justify those things when there's a clear sign in the calendar or a part of the work that we've completed. But that I think great leaders often make up an excuse to have these things when they think they need one. And so whatever excuse you can come up with, I think that's a good excuse. And rather than to frame it as incidental, I would actually be very much more purposeful in trying to make a difference with what we've done before. So in other words, if we were meeting on Tuesdays as our weekly meeting, I would meet on a different day. I would do it in a different room. I would
send a signal.
Invite other people to play different roles maybe than they've played before. So if you've been facilitating all the meetings, maybe suggest that somebody else facilitates part or plays a different role than they were playing. Anything you can do to shake things up and really create that sense of newness is really important, because social norms are really sticky and that we don't give them up easily. So if we've got a team that has developed these kind of norms where we're not really speaking up, where we're not trying our hardest, we're going to have to work hard to break those things. And that just, kind of doing it halfway often won't quite be enough.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. What's the biggest mistake you see leaders make when it comes to mistakes that potentially undermine teams?
So I think the biggest mistake is they're just not really paying attention to teams as the unit of thing that they're supposed to be managing. So many organizations are geared towards managing individuals. All the performance metrics are individual. Promotions, punishments, firings, everything is oriented towards individuals. So we create these systems for managing individual performance. And then, as we said, there's always a tension, right? Even in an organization where we all seemingly have the same goals, there's times where our individual goals, what's going to get me promoted, what's going to get me credit, what's going to get my boss upset with me, are at odds with the collective goals. And so if we don't have whole systems that are stacking the deck in favor of group performance, not just individual performance, we're not going to have very effective teams. And so if everything in your organization and your handbook and your performance management system is about individuals, and then you come to me and say, our teams aren't doing very well. It's like, you've created a whole system that's not supportive of teams. So the first thing is just paying attention. You're already ahead of a lot of the world if you're asking this question, how do I make my groups better? And then the other things is then stack the deck. That, just like, we shouldn't all go spend all of our time in a casino playing a game that's stacked against us. Yet when we put teams in organizations out there in the world, we're often putting them into games that they're stacked against them, that they're in a system that's designed for individuals, that's designed to kind of keep them pulling apart and going in their individual directions rather than coming together. And so the main thing I would say is an unwillingness to change these systemic factors about the structure that the group is in and the structure the group operates then, and instead going straight to group process and saying, we've got these problems. I'm going to try to, do some trust falls and get you to trust each other more. And that's going to fix everything. And, it's just not going to fix it for long. Even if you have a really effective intervention that's focused on process, but you're still operating in a bad structure is eventually going to win again. That structure is always going to overcome these processual forces in the long run. So we need systems and structure, and we need the right mindset to actually see the team as the unit that will deliver the performance. Is that fair? Yes, absolutely. That's a great summary of it.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot to take in because we as organizations are not built to do that.
No.
But I love that you put this on the agenda. Where can people find out more about you and the book?
So you can find out about me and order the book at colinmfisher.com. And I hope you'll follow me on LinkedIn, subscribe to my newsletter, and please pick up the book and let me know if you like it.
What's it called?
It is called The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups.
Yes, and I love it. It's highly recommended. The book is so good, and there's a lot of the research, a lot of the examples you've heard, but many more as well. And it's one of these rare books that shifts your thinking about how we interact at work and how we should communicate at work. So really appreciate the work you've done, Colin, over many years now that culminated in this book now. And this is always my final question. What's your best piece of communications advice?
So, from as a group scholar, I think the thing I've learned so much from studying groups is don't make assumptions that other people think the way you think. And so if you come in with the assumption that, hey, this other person may see the world completely differently, and everything I'm doing is oriented towards learning about what your perspective is, I think we'll have much more effective communication. So a learning orientation to conversations, to make explicit things that I often don't think need to be made explicit, like the goals or the norms of our group, and to really discuss those things and make sure we're on the same page, I think is my main communication advice.
Absolutely. I love it when people come from a position of curiosity rather than certainty. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes we make in conversations, that we believe we already know what the other person's thinking and will say, and therefore we're not really listening. And that can be a big problem. So curiosity, openness in those conversations, beautiful. Colin, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oliver.
All the best for the book. And hope to continue our conversation. Your wife's German, so maybe we can meet up in person at some point.
Yes, absolutely. Really looking forward to it.